I found out my brother was getting married from a photo my best friend sent me. A cream-colored wedding invitation with gold lettering, my family's names printed neatly mine. Missing like I had never existed. This wasn't some oversight. Michael knew exactly what he was doing. We'd been at war since Dad died and left us the island in the Keys and a 150-foot yacht. He wanted to sell it off. I wanted to keep it as family legacy. I thought cutting me out of the wedding was the final insult until my billionaire fiancée looked at me and said we should take the yacht sail to the Bahamas and remind him what real power looks like. The smell of salt water had always been a part of my life, even now that I lived 3,000 miles from the coast I grew up on. That afternoon, I was sitting at my kitchen table in Portland sketching a design for a maritime museum renovation when my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen and saw a text from my mother. It was short. Just a reminder about Sunday dinner. No mention of anything else, no warmth either, which was unusual for her. I brushed it off at first, but there was something in the pit of my stomach that told me she was avoiding saying something. I decided to call her. The line rang longer than usual before she picked up. Her voice was polite, almost overly so, like she was choosing each word with care. I asked her if she'd been busy, and she said yes, Michael had kept her running around with last-minute arrangements. Arrangements for what I asked. There was a pause. Too long. Then she said she had to go because something was burning on the stove. She hung up before I could ask again. I sat there staring at the phone, a memory rising to the surface like a wave I couldn't push back. The fights, the cold dinners, the slammed doors after Dad died. The will that had split our family in two. I thought about the island in the Keys, the one Dad bought when I was a kid, the summers we spent sailing, the family's pride, a 150-foot yacht worth more than most people would see in their lifetimes. And I thought about the year after Dad's funeral when Michael suggested we turn the island into a luxury resort. I'd told him no, that it was Dad's legacy, not a business opportunity. That was when the lines were drawn. A ding pulled me back to the present. This time it was a message from Dylan, my oldest friend from our hometown. No words, just a photo. It took me a second to process what I was looking at. It was a cream-colored card with gold embossing our family name printed in bold, the names Michael Caldwell and Emily Hart intertwined in a flowing script, a wedding invitation. I scrolled down. The date was set for next month, a beachfront ceremony in Miami followed by a reception at one of the most exclusive hotels in the city. My hands went cold. Dylan must have sensed it because another text came through. Guess mine wasn't meant for you. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I stared at the invitation until the letters blurred. It wasn't that I expected to be best man. I hadn't been close to Michael in years, but this wasn't an oversight. This was deliberate. He had gone out of his way to exclude me. And Mom, she knew. That's why her voice was so careful on the phone. I stood up and paced the kitchen. Every memory of Michael's smirk when he got the upper hand. Every time he'd cut me out of a conversation with Dad's old business contacts, every backhanded comment at family gatherings, all of it surged through me. This wasn't about a wedding. It was about erasing me from the family narrative. The evening light filtered through the blinds, casting lines across the sketches on my table. I sat back down, trying to distract myself, but my mind kept replaying that photo. I imagined Michael laughing with his friends, telling them how he'd kept his troublesome little brother away from his big day. I imagined him walking Mom down the aisle without me there. The cameras capturing a perfect family moment minus the inconvenient sibling. By the time the sky outside turned indigo, I'd stopped trying to work. I poured myself a glass of bourbon and stared at the map of Florida Keys hanging on my wall. My eyes traced the outline of our island. I thought about the yacht anchored there, the one I hadn't set foot on in years. I wondered if Michael planned to use it for the wedding. The idea burned in my chest. The phone buzzed again. This time it was Mom sending me a heart emoji, as if that made up for the silence. I didn't answer. I turned off the phone, set the glass down, and let the weight of the day settle over me. Outside, the city lights shimmered on the river, but all I could see was that cream-colored card and the certainty behind it. Michael hadn't just forgotten me. He'd made sure I knew I wasn't welcome. I stayed there in the dim kitchen, the bourbon untouched, feeling the slow, cold pull of something I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't sadness. It was the beginning of resolve. The last time I had felt that same tightness in my chest was the summer of 20, the year we buried Dad. The heat in Miami was relentless, the kind that made the air shimmer over the asphalt. I remember sitting in the lawyer's office, the will spread out on polished mahogany, Mom beside me dabbing her eyes with a tissue. Michael sat across from us in his tailored navy suit, already looking like the kind of man who saw opportunities where others saw grief. Dad's voice had been clear in the will. The island in the Bahamas would remain in the family untouched, a place for us to gather to remember. The yacht, the Seafarer, was included in that vision, a floating piece of our history. I felt a weight lift when I heard those words. For a moment it was like Dad was still in the room. But as soon as we stepped outside, Michael was on the phone, pacing the sidewalk, talking about investor meetings. I overheard enough to know he wasn't talking about preserving anything. That night over dinner at Mom's, he laid it out. A luxury resort on the island. Private villas, a golf course, a spa. He had the blueprints ready, the numbers worked out. He said it would be a shame to waste prime property on nostalgia. I told him it wasn't his decision to make. He smirked and said I was being sentimental, that Dad's legacy could fund our future. Mom stayed quiet, her fork barely touching her plate. I pushed my chair back and left before dessert. Weeks passed and I tried to believe he would drop the idea. Then one afternoon I got a call from a friend who worked at a bank in Nassau. He said my brother had been in touch about refinancing a loan tied to the island's title. My stomach turned. I drove straight to Michael's office in downtown Miami, the one with the glass walls and the view of Biscayne Bay. He didn't look surprised to see me. He leaned back in his leather chair and said the loan was nothing to worry about, just a bit of leverage for future projects. I pressed him, asking if Mom knew. He shrugged and said it wasn't her concern. The loan wasn't illegal, but it was big enough that if the deal went bad, we could lose everything Dad had left us. I felt the air leave my lungs. It wasn't just the risk, it was the secrecy. That night I stood on the dock beside the Seafarer. The sun was setting, the water painted in streaks of orange and gold. I ran my hand along the rail, remembering when Dad let me take the wheel for the first time. I thought about the trust we'd had as kids, how we'd cover for each other when we got into trouble. I tried to picture that boyhood bond now, but all I could see was the man in the glass office spinning numbers, calculating odds, and leaving me out of the conversation. A week later, Michael invited me to lunch at a waterfront restaurant. I went hoping we could salvage something. He ordered a bottle of wine before I even sat down. Between bites of grilled grouper, he told me he'd secured a partner for the resort project. The way he said it, you'd think it was a gift he was giving me. I told him again I wanted no part of it. His smile faded, and for a split second I saw something sharp in his eyes. Then he laughed and changed the subject, asking about my work in the Navy as if the last 10 minutes hadn't happened. I left the table knowing something had shifted. It wasn't a fight you could patch up with an apology. It was a fracture running deep under the surface, one that would keep widening every time he chose ambition over family. Driving home across the causeway, the city skyline behind me, I realized that this was the moment it started to break apart. The moment the word brother stopped feeling like a promise and started feeling like a warning. When I walked into the penthouse that night, the city lights were spilling across the hardwood floors and Vanessa was curled up on the couch with her laptop balanced on her knees. She looked up as I closed the door and set my keys on the counter. I must have still been carrying the weight of the day because her eyes narrowed immediately. She set the laptop aside and asked what happened. I told her everything. The wedding invitation I never got, the picture Dylan sent me, the way Mom avoided the truth. Her expression didn't shift much, but I could tell she was processing every word. Vanessa had a way of listening that made you feel like the room had shrunk down to just you and her. No noise, no distractions. When I finished, she leaned back against the couch, her silk robe falling open at the collarbone. She didn't offer sympathy. That wasn't her style. Instead, she asked me what I wanted to do about it. I said I hadn't decided yet, that part of me wanted to call Michael and demand an explanation, and another part wanted to ignore it completely. She tilted her head, a small smile playing at the corner of her mouth. She said ignoring it would give him exactly what he wanted, and confronting him directly would only feed his ego. Then she suggested something else. We should take the seafarer out to the Bahamas during the wedding weekend. Make a statement without saying a word. She said we could sail past the island, host our own celebration on the water, and let him know he wasn't the only one who could make headlines. I laughed at first, but the more she talked, the more the idea took root. Vanessa wasn't just my fiancée. She was one of the most influential women in the biotech industry, a self-made billionaire who had built her company from a single lab in Palo Alto to an international empire. If anyone understood how to turn an insult into leverage, it was her. I was pouring us both a drink when her phone buzzed on the coffee table. She glanced at the screen, frowned, and handed it to me. It was a message from one of her contacts in Nassau, a real estate attorney she'd worked with before. He wrote that he'd heard Michael was in final talks to sell the island to a foreign development group. The deal was scheduled to be signed the week before the wedding. I felt the blood rush to my ears. Selling the island had been his dream for years, but this was different. This was the final nail. If the papers were signed, the island would be gone for good. There would be no reversing it. I set the glass down harder than I meant to, and the ice rattled against the sides. Vanessa came to stand beside me, her hand resting lightly on my arm. She asked how soon we could leave if we decided to go. I told her the seafarer needed some prep work, but I could have it ready in a few days. She smiled like she already knew the answer. Then she said we wouldn't just be sailing for show. We'd be sailing to put ourselves exactly where we needed to be. I stepped out onto the balcony for some air. The wind was cool off the bay, carrying the faint scent of salt. My mind was already spinning through the logistics. Crew supplies route. But under all of that was something sharper, more urgent. The clock had started ticking, and every hour that passed brought Michael closer to closing that deal. Behind me, Vanessa was back on her laptop, firing off emails, her fingers moving so fast they were a blur. She caught my eye and said she'd handle a few calls in the morning to make sure we had the right people in place. She didn't need to explain what that meant. In her world, the right people could open doors before anyone else knew they existed. I stayed outside until the air began to chill. Below, the streets were still alive with traffic, the sound of horns and engines drifting upward. I thought about the island again, the last time I'd stood on its sand, the way the water lapped at the shore like it had for centuries. I thought about Dad's voice telling me it was ours to protect, and I thought about Michael smiling for the cameras at his wedding, believing he'd finally won. When I came back inside, Vanessa was closing her laptop. She walked over, kissed me on the cheek, and said she'd start packing tomorrow. I didn't answer right away. I just stood there feeling the ground shift beneath us, knowing that what started as a family insult was about to become something much bigger. The next morning, Vanessa had already arranged a meeting before I even finished my coffee. She told me Daniel Cortez was expecting us at his office downtown. I had worked with Daniel once before on a boundary dispute involving the marina. He was sharp, thorough, and the kind of lawyer who could make you feel both relieved and uneasy in the same breath. His office overlooked Biscayne Bay, the morning light bouncing off the water and flooding the glass-walled conference room. Daniel shook my hand firmly, then took Vanessa's with a respectful nod. He wasted no time. Vanessa had already briefed him on what we knew, and he had pulled the public filings on the island sale overnight. He slid a stack of papers toward me and tapped a section in the middle. This clause, he said, was the one that caught his attention. It required the seller to guarantee clear and undisputed title to the property, including all structures, dock rights, and surrounding waters. On the surface, it looked standard, but Daniel explained that any existing dispute, even one buried in the past, could be grounds for the buyer to sue for damages after closing. I leaned back in my chair, trying to connect it to what I already knew. This wasn't about Michael's old loan. This was something newer and potentially more dangerous for him. If the buyers found out there was any irregularity in the island's ownership history, the deal could collapse, and worse for Michael, they could drag him into court. Daniel walked us through the island's chain of title. It had passed from the Bahamian government to our grandfather in the 1960s, then to Dad, and then split between Michael and me after Dad's death. That split was never meant to be equal, but it had been adjusted later in a private agreement that Michael never registered with Bahamian authorities. On paper, there was still ambiguity. Vanessa asked how easy it would be for a buyer to discover that. Daniel smiled faintly and said it would depend on whether they had reason to look. Then he opened his laptop and pulled up an email thread he had obtained through one of his contacts in Nassau. It was from an executive at the development group negotiating with Michael. In it, they discussed concerns about the island's title, specifically mentioning my name as a potential co-owner who had not been consulted. I felt a current of energy shoot through me. That was leverage, real tangible leverage. Vanessa's eyes lit up too. She asked Daniel how he got the email. He just said he had friends who owed him favors and that it was best we didn't ask for details. We talked through scenarios. If the buyers pushed for clarification before signing, Michael would have to involve me or risk the deal falling apart. If he ignored it and they found out afterward, they could sue him, costing millions and wrecking his reputation. Either way, he was exposed. Daniel cautioned us to move carefully. If Michael suspected we had this information, he might find a way to paper over the problem before the deal cleared. The key was to be in the right place at the right time, ready to act if the opportunity presented itself. Vanessa mentioned the sailing trip again, and I realized it would put us close enough to the island to react instantly. We spent another hour going over the timeline. The contract signing was scheduled for the Thursday before the wedding. That gave us less than 2 weeks. The seafarer would need to leave Miami within days to arrive in Bahamian waters with enough time to maneuver. Before we left, Daniel looked me in the eye and told me this wasn't just about family anymore. If we played it wrong, Michael could turn the narrative against us. But if we played it right, he would be the one scrambling to explain himself. Walking out of the building, the heat hit me like a wall. Vanessa slipped her sunglasses on and said she liked Daniel. I said I did too, though part of me wondered just how far he was willing to go for a client. We drove back toward the marina, the thought of that email burning in my mind. Somewhere in a corporate office, people were already questioning Michael's right to sell the island. They didn't know yet that I had seen their doubts in writing. When we reached the dock, the seafarer was waiting, her white hull gleaming in the sun. I ran my hand along the railing, feeling the familiar smoothness of the teak. This was more than a boat now. It was our way in our way to watch the storm gather and decide when to strike. Vanessa was already on her phone lining up supplies and crew. I stood at the edge of the dock looking out toward the horizon, knowing the next move had to be timed perfectly. The tide would be with us soon. We cast off under a sky that was half sun and half warning. The crew moved with quiet precision, lines coiled and sails unfurling, the seafarer sliding out of the marina like she had been waiting for this exact moment. The city faded behind us, replaced by open water that shimmered with a deceptive calm. Vanessa stood at the helm for the first few miles, her hair pulled back against the wind, eyes fixed on the horizon. I handled the navigation, checking our course toward the Bahamas and keeping an eye on the radar. The forecast had mentioned a passing squall, nothing severe but enough to keep us sharp. By late afternoon, the sky had darkened in the west, clouds piling like steel over the water. The wind shifted sharp and salty, and the first drops hit my face just as Vanessa handed me the helm. The crew moved quickly to reef the mainsail, their voices raised over the growing rush of wind. The squall came fast, a gray wall swallowing the horizon, rain lashing the deck in sheets. The seafarer pitched and rolled the rigging, groaning with every gust. Vanessa braced beside me, calling out adjustments, her voice steady but her knuckles white around the rail. It wasn't dangerous yet, but it was enough to test our timing, our trust in each other and the boat. We worked in rhythm, she on the sheets, me on the wheel, feeling the surge of water beneath us and riding it instead of fighting it. 10 minutes in the worst had passed, the rain easing to a drizzle, the sea settling back into long rolling swells. The crew laughed in that relieved way sailors do, as if we had all silently agreed not to speak of the moments when we wondered if the storm would turn. Vanessa disappeared below deck for a few minutes and came back with her phone in hand. She told me she had been thinking about someone who might help us keep a closer watch on Michael from afar. Sophia Grant. I knew the name. She was a journalist who had broken stories that toppled city officials and exposed corporate fraud. If Vanessa trusted her, it meant she had a knack for getting the truth without getting caught. She stepped to the aft deck, the wind pulling at her voice as she spoke into the phone. I kept my eyes on the water, but my ears on her half of the conversation. She was calm but precise, laying out just enough for Sophia to be interested without spilling anything we couldn't take back. When Vanessa returned, her expression was sharper, more focused. Sophia had agreed to dig. More than that, she already had something. She told Vanessa that Michael's name had surfaced in connection with a land acquisition in Miami's Edgewater district. The deal was still quiet, under review by a city zoning committee, but there were whispers of irregularities in the permit process. Someone in the city government had flagged the project for closer scrutiny, and there was a file on it sitting in a locked office. Vanessa sat beside me on the bench. Her voice low. Sophia said if someone wanted to push that story into the light, it could hit Michael at the exact wrong moment. Not only would it rattle his investors, it would stain his reputation in a way that couldn't be scrubbed clean before the wedding or the island sale. I felt the boat lift on a swell, the bow pointing briefly toward the horizon before dipping again. The idea of a second front against Michael, one we didn't even have to create, was tempting. But I also knew it was dangerous. If we were tied to it, he could use it to paint us as vindictive, and that could backfire fast. Vanessa seemed to read my hesitation. She said Sophia was good at what she did. If this came out, it wouldn't be traced to us. All we had to do was make sure it came out at the right time. The sun broke through the clouds, then lighting the water in silver and gold. I stayed quiet, letting the hum of the rigging and the steady pull of the wind fill the space between us. Out here, with nothing but water in every direction, it was easy to imagine we had already left the rest of it behind. But I knew the storm we were heading toward on land was far bigger than the one we had just sailed through. As night fell, the crew settled into shifts, the sea calm again, the stars beginning to show. I stood at the bow for a while, watching the faint line where the dark water met the darker sky, thinking about Michael the island. And now this new thread Sophia had handed us. We had wind in our sails and time on our side, but only for now. The email from my mother came early in the morning, just as the first light began to spill across the deck. I had been up since before dawn, the smell of coffee mixing with the salt air. When I saw her name in my inbox, the subject line was short and heavy. I opened it and felt my chest tighten as I read. Michael had filed official papers to remove me from the family inheritance. No explanation, no call, just a legal notice sent through her to soften the blow. Vanessa was still wrapped in a blanket in the saloon when I told her. She didn't flinch, didn't let the news stick to her the way it was sticking to me. She said it was exactly the kind of move we expected from him, and that it didn't change the leverage we had. She reminded me we weren't fighting for scraps. We were protecting what was ours and setting the stage for something he wouldn't see coming. Daniel called an hour later, his voice brisk and controlled. He had reviewed the new documents we'd pulled from Michael's deal and confirmed what we suspected: there was enough in them to block the island sale if we played it right. The internal email from his partner about ownership doubts could be the crack that split the whole agreement apart. Daniel said timing was everything. If we moved too soon, Michael could patch the damage. If we waited until the right moment, it could sink the deal entirely. By midday, the water was calm again, the horizon a clean line under a pale blue sky. I was in the middle of checking the charts when Vanessa's phone lit up with a message from Sophia. The first story had gone live. An anonymous tip to a major Miami news outlet had triggered a breaking headline: a high-profile development project in Edgewater under quiet city review for potential zoning violations. The article didn't name Michael directly, but the description of the project made it obvious to anyone in the industry. Within an hour, it was all over local media. Talk radio hosts debated whether the city was cracking down on corruption or just playing politics. Business forums speculated about which developers might be caught in the dragnet. And then, just after lunch, the push alert came through. Michael Caldwell would hold a press conference at his downtown Miami office to address recent rumors and misinformation. Vanessa and I streamed it live from the cabin, the satellite connection a little choppy but clear enough. Michael stood at a podium, his jaw tight, his smile rehearsed. He denied everything, said his projects were in full compliance with all city codes, accused unnamed competitors of trying to smear his name. He was doing well until a reporter asked if the island property in the Bahamas was also under review. That's when he stumbled. He said no, the island was a separate matter and already under final transfer to our offshore partners. Offshore partners. He said it twice too fast, as if repeating it made it harmless. Vanessa shot me a look. Daniel texted seconds later. Michael had just confirmed a key detail he'd been trying to keep quiet. The kind of detail that could raise questions with regulators, investors, even the IRS. The press conference ended abruptly after that, his aides cutting off questions and steering him out of the room. The news anchors replayed the offshore partners line on a loop, analysts weighing in about how unusual it was for a Miami developer to sell island property through a non-US entity. The speculation had already started, and Michael himself had lit the match. Vanessa closed her laptop and leaned back, the swell rocking us gently. She said this was the beginning of the shift, not the end, but the moment he stopped controlling the narrative. I stared out at the water, feeling the same thing. Somewhere in Miami, Michael was realizing he'd just made his first public mistake in years. And we hadn't even touched the full weight of what we could use against him. The sun dipped lower, painting the sea in gold, but I barely noticed. The storm we were building wasn't out here on the water. It was gathering over him, and for the first time he was starting to feel the wind change. I woke to the low hum of the engines and the muffled clink of coffee mugs in the galley. The morning air was sharp heavy with the scent of salt and fuel. Vanessa was already on deck, her phone in hand, gaze fixed on the screen. She didn't look up when I approached, just tilted it so I could see the email from my mother. Michael had made it official. My name was no longer on the trust. It wasn't a threat anymore. It was done. I felt something tighten in my chest, not quite pain, not quite rage. Vanessa reached for my hand. "It's exactly what we expected," she said quietly. "And it doesn't change the leverage we have." Before I could answer, Daniel's voice cut in from below. He came up the companionway with a printout in one hand and a grim look on his face. "The clauses in that draft sale agreement are worse than I thought," he said. "If the buyers dig into the permitting history Michael's exposed, we can make him sweat." I glanced between them, trying to read whether they believed this was still just strategy or if they felt the same undercurrent I did, that this was turning personal in a way you couldn't walk back from. Then Vanessa's phone pinged again. This time it was Sophia. She had pushed the first anonymous leak to a couple of online outlets. A pointed question about irregularities in a Miami land project Michael was tied to. It took less than an hour before the first blog picked it up, then a business site, and then local TV. By mid-morning, Michael was standing behind a podium in a hotel conference room in Coral Gables, flanked by two of his lawyers. The footage streamed to Vanessa's tablet. His jaw was tight, his tone clipped. He kept insisting the questions were baseless, that everything was above board. Then a reporter asked about a specific parcel in Little Havana, and Michael, maybe thinking he was shutting it down, let slip a detail that hadn't been public, one that confirmed the rumors had teeth. Daniel sat back, almost smiling. That's an admission, even if he doesn't realize it. The phone in my pocket vibrated. I didn't need to look to know who it was. I answered anyway. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Michael's voice was low, but shaking, the kind of tremor that comes when someone is barely holding it together. "You think you can smear me from a boat and I won't push back?" "Push all you want," I said. "You already pushed me out of the wedding, out of the family. There's not much left to take." "I can take your job," he snapped. "I can make sure the Navy contractors never hire you again. You'll be done in Seattle by the end of the month." I let the silence stretch until I could hear him breathing. "You really want to go there after everything? After Dad's island, the lies, the way you've treated Mom? Don't you drag her into this?" he growled, and then the line went dead. Vanessa was watching me closely when I lowered the phone. "He's scared," she said simply. Sophia called later that afternoon. She had tracked down a former project manager from one of Michael's developments, a man who'd left suddenly, no explanation. He was willing to talk. She arranged to meet him the next day in Fort Lauderdale. Even over the phone, I could hear the edge in her voice. "If half of what he's hinting at is true, your brother's in deeper trouble than you think." As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Daniel spread a chart across the cockpit table. "I've been checking the registry filings," he said. "Michael's moved up the closing date on the island sale. He's trying to get it signed before the wedding, probably to avoid a court injunction if we file." "How soon?" I asked. 2 days. The day before the ceremony." The idea of him smiling for wedding photos, knowing he'd just sold off the last piece of our father's legacy, twisted in my gut. "Then we don't have much time." The swell picked up after sunset, the motion of the boat matching the churn in my head. Vanessa stood beside me at the rail, her hair whipped back by the wind. "We can't match his speed on land," she said. "But we can be there when it matters, and we can make sure he knows we're watching every move." In the distance, lightning flickered along the horizon. The storm hadn't hit yet, but you could feel it building, the pressure dropping, the air electric. I knew it wasn't just the weather closing in. The evening air was thick with the scent of salt and frangipani as we stepped off the tender onto the dock of Crescent Key. Lanterns swung gently above us, their golden glow reflecting off the dark water. The party was already in full swing, the sound of clinking glasses and a string quartet drifting across the manicured lawn. I felt Vanessa's hand tighten on my arm, not from nerves, but from focus. We both knew tonight wasn't just another social event. It was the calm before a very specific kind of storm. Crescent Key was one of those places built for exclusivity, the kind of private island where the sand is raked every morning and staff move like shadows anticipating needs before you voice them. The main pavilion, a sweeping white structure with open sides, glowed under a canopy of lights. Inside, the guests shimmered with wealth, designer gowns, bespoke suits, diamonds catching the light like flashes of lightning in miniature. Vanessa leaned close and murmured that Sophia had just sent her a text. The first major paper had gone live with the story, a cautious headline, nothing explosive yet, but enough to plant seeds in every curious mind in the city. I pictured the article spreading, copied into group chats, whispered over champagne. It was only a matter of time before those seeds sprouted. We mingled carefully, exchanging pleasantries with people I had only ever seen in financial magazines. I caught sight of Michael across the pavilion, his arm draped around his fiancée Alana. He looked immaculate as always, navy suit, perfect tie, not a hair out of place. But there was a stiffness in his posture, like a man standing in a stiff wind pretending he wasn't cold. Our eyes met for half a second. His expression didn't change, but I could see the calculation there. The music swelled as the master of ceremonies, a tall man with the smooth voice of a seasoned entertainer, stepped onto the stage at the front. He began introducing key guests, thanking sponsors, and noting the significance of the upcoming wedding. My stomach tightened. I had a feeling I knew where this was going, though I doubted he had been briefed on the new tension hanging in the air. Midway through his speech, the MC made a light-hearted joke about Michael's uncanny ability to close deals before the ink is dry. Sometimes even before the permits are in place, the line landed like a thunderclap. A murmur rolled through the crowd, soft but unmistakable. Faces turned, some toward Michael, others toward each other. A few guests actually laughed, the kind of brittle laughter people use when they're not sure if they're supposed to. I saw Michael's jaw tighten, his hand dropping from Alana's waist. In that instant, the MC realized he had stepped into something he didn't understand. But it was too late. The joke hung in the humid air, impossible to take back. Someone near me whispered something about the article, and another voice answered too loud that they had already read it. Michael's eyes swept the crowd, then fixed on the MC with a look sharp enough to cut glass. He excused himself abruptly, muttering to Alana, and strode off toward the edge of the pavilion. The exit wasn't dramatic in volume, but in optics. Watching a man like Michael walk away in the middle of his own pre-wedding celebration was louder than any public argument could have been. Vanessa leaned in again and said softly that this was only the first crack. Her voice was calm, but her eyes tracked Michael's retreat the way a sailor watches the horizon for signs of a break in the weather. Around us, conversations resumed, but the undercurrent had changed. The charm had thinned, replaced by speculation. Guests checked their phones under the tables. Laughter was a shade too loud, glances a shade too quick. We stepped out onto the veranda, the night breeze carrying faint strains of music. The moon hung low over the water, a silver coin tossed onto black velvet. From here I could see Michael at the far end of the lawn, speaking in low, clipped tones to two men I didn't recognize. His gestures were sharp, almost impatient. Every so often he glanced back toward the pavilion as if to make sure no one was close enough to overhear. Sophia's name lit up my phone. She had managed to confirm that Michael had been scrambling all afternoon calling lawyers and pushing to move up the signing of the island deal. He was betting on speed to outrun the shadow of the story. I told her to keep pressing the angle we'd discussed. If he signed before the wedding, we'd have everything we needed to freeze the deal within hours. Back inside, the MC had recovered, moving on to the charity auction. The tension lingered, though, a ghost at every table. I noticed Alana circulating alone now, smiling with just a hint too much effort. People watched her the way people watch a chandelier sway, admiring the beauty but aware of the potential for disaster. As the night wound down, Vanessa and I kept our movements deliberate. We didn't need to confront Michael tonight. The point had already been made without a single word from me. Sometimes humiliation doesn't require volume, it just requires the right audience and the wrong moment. When we finally boarded the tender back to our yacht, I looked over my shoulder at the island receding into the dark. The lights of the pavilion blurred against the horizon, and I knew that whatever Michael had planned tonight had planted doubts in places he couldn't control. And once doubt takes root in a room like that, it grows fast. The morning broke hot and still, the kind of Caribbean heat that seems to settle into your bones. From the deck of the yacht, I could see the faint outline of Nassau on the horizon, a hazy smudge between the sea and the sky. Vanessa was already up, her laptop open on the teak table, the glow of the screen reflected in her sunglasses. She didn't look up when she said there was breaking news. I stepped closer, my coffee forgotten in my hand. On the screen, a live feed from a local network showed Michael and Alana's wedding venue, white canopies fluttering in the breeze, rows of guests in their finest. A red banner at the bottom of the screen flashed state officials open formal investigation into Caldwell Holdings. The anchor's voice was calm, professional, but there was a current of satisfaction in it, the kind reserved for stories everyone in the newsroom had been waiting to tell. The details came quickly. Regulatory officers were now reviewing multiple land development projects linked to Michael, including the Crescent Key deal. It wasn't just a whisper in an article anymore, it was official. Paperwork had been filed, warrants were being discussed. The camera cut between shots of the wedding guests arriving and the courthouse steps where a press conference was expected later that day. Vanessa's phone buzzed on the table. It was Sophia. I could hear her voice through the speaker, brisk and almost breathless. She said a former partner of Michael's had just gone on record with a rival network. He was naming names, dates, and deals, and the picture he painted was ugly. According to him, Michael had cut him out of a multi-million-dollar marina project years ago using forged signatures and backroom promises. They'd been best friends since college, and Michael had gutted him without a second thought. It wasn't the kind of betrayal you could spin away with legal jargon. This was personal, intimate, the sort of story that spreads because people want to repeat it. Sophia said the man had photos, old emails, even a voice message from the week before the betrayal where Michael was telling him they were in it together. The segment was already trending online. I sat down slowly, the heat pressing in on me, listening as the feed shifted to footage of Michael outside the wedding pavilion. His smile was there, but it didn't reach his eyes. I imagined the buzz inside the crowd, phones lighting up in pockets, whispers passing from table to table. This wasn't just embarrassment anymore. This was a fracture in his identity. Vanessa closed her laptop with a quiet click. She said this was the kind of blow you don't recover from, not in his circles. Deals are built on reputation, and reputations in that world are as fragile as spun glass. Once people believe you'll turn on your closest ally, they start wondering when you'll turn on them. The ceremony began, the feed showing the officiant's practiced smile, Alana's careful walk down the aisle. But my focus stayed on Michael. His jaw was tight, his gaze fixed forward. I wondered how much of the words he was hearing, how much of his mind was in that moment, and how much was scrambling through the wreckage of his image. Sophia called again as we were watching the vows. She said the former partner had been invited onto a prime-time slot that night. It would be a deep dive, complete with documents and a timeline of the betrayal. Once it aired, she said no amount of public relations could put the pieces back together. She also mentioned that 2 of Michael's current investors had already called to review their commitments. That was the language people used when they were halfway out the door. As the ceremony wrapped, the network feed briefly caught Michael stepping away from the reception line, phone in hand. His expression raw and unguarded for a split second. It wasn't anger. It was something heavier. Fear. The yacht swayed gently under my feet as I leaned on the rail, the salt breeze on my face. Somewhere on that island, my brother was shaking hands, accepting congratulations, smiling for photographs. But outside that bubble, his world was coming apart in real time. And this time it wouldn't be fixed by a check or a charm offensive. Vanessa joined me, her hand brushing mine. She didn't speak, and she didn't need to. We both knew this was the moment the tide had turned for good. Whatever happened next, the man Michael had been in the eyes of his peers was gone. What was left was a man people would cross the street to avoid. We stayed on the deck until the sun climbed high, the ceremony long over, the news cycle still churning. Somewhere between the sound of the water and the hum of the engines, I realized we had reached a point of no return. Not for the deal, not for the inheritance. For him, and there's no sailing back from that. Michael's name lit up my phone just after noon. I let it ring once before answering, keeping my voice steady while my pulse pounded. He sounded smaller than I had ever heard him, the sharp edges stripped away. He asked if we could talk face to face. I told him where to meet me. We gathered in the sunroom of my mother's house in Coral Gables. The windows were open to the sound of the palms outside, but the air inside was tight. Linda sat in her armchair, hands folded on her lap, watching us like she could feel the weight of every word before it landed. Michael stood by the door, shifting his weight, eyes darting to her and then back to me. He started with a plea. He wanted this to end quietly. He said there was no need to drag the family through more public humiliation, no reason to keep fighting. His voice cracked on the word family. I let him speak, then told him it was simple. He would return full ownership of the island and the yacht, sign everything over in writing, and he would stand in front of our mother and tell her he was sorry. Not the half-hearted apologies he had thrown out in the past, but one that meant something. Michael's jaw tightened. He said I was asking him to give away everything he had built. I reminded him he had built it on something that was never his. His eyes flicked to Linda, but she stayed silent, her gaze fixed on him like she was seeing through every excuse he had ever made. I pushed the papers across the coffee table toward him. Daniel had drawn them up clean and airtight. Michael looked at them like they were a death sentence. He asked if there was any other way. I told him no. Linda spoke, then her voice soft but carrying across the room. She said she still remembered the summer Dad bought the island, how Michael had been 15 and couldn't stop talking about the fishing trips he would take, how I was 9 and insisted the yacht should have a room just for board games. She said she remembered the way the 2 of us used to race each other down the dock, how we fought over who got to steer first, how Dad laughed every time we came back soaking wet from jumping off the stern. Her voice trembled, but she didn't cry. Michael's eyes dropped to the floor. I could see his shoulders tighten like he was trying to hold something in. Linda told him she had believed for years that he was the one who would protect that place, that he understood it was more than a piece of land, that it was the center of our family. She said watching the 2 of us now felt like watching the house burn down twice. He paced the length of the room, hands on his hips, breathing hard. I stayed in my seat, letting the silence push at him. Outside, a car drove past, and the sound seemed too loud in the stillness. He stopped pacing and turned to me, his face tight. He asked what would happen if he refused. I told him he already knew the answer. The investigation, the headlines, the lawsuits, none of it would stop. He would lose the property in court and his name in the process. Linda stood up, moving between us. She put a hand on his arm and told him she had been proud of him once. Proud of what he had built, but she could not be proud of what he had become if he chose pride over what was right. She asked him if he could still look her in the eye after this. Michael didn't answer. He looked past her to the open window, to the sound of the wind moving through the palms. His hand trembled when he reached for the pen. He sat down and signed the documents, each stroke heavier than the last. When he was done, he set the pen down and leaned back like the air had gone out of him. I picked up the papers and checked the signatures. They were all there. I told him it was time for the other part. He turned to Linda, his mouth opening and closing once before the words came. He said he was sorry for taking what wasn't his, for shutting me out, for letting greed matter more than family. His voice broke halfway through, and for a moment he sounded like the brother I remembered. Linda's eyes were wet, but she nodded. She told him that forgiveness would take time, but that this was a start. Michael looked down at his hands, then stood and walked to the door. He paused like he might say something else, but then left without another word. The room felt lighter when he was gone, though the air still carried the echo of everything that had been said. Linda sat back down, her shoulders loosening, and I realized she was breathing easier. Outside, the wind shifted and the sound of the palms changed softer now, like the storm had passed just enough for us to see the sky again. The first thing I noticed stepping off the plane in Seattle was the crisp bite in the air. The kind you don't get in the Bahamas, no matter the season. Vanessa laced her arm through mine as we walked toward the car service, the rain-slicked tarmac glinting under the morning sun. There was a quiet between us, not awkward, but weighted with the kind of satisfaction you get only after surviving a storm you weren't sure you could navigate. The island and the yacht were mine again, signed over in a settlement that felt less like a victory on paper and more like a reclaiming of something sacred. Vanessa squeezed my hand when she saw me glance at the paperwork in my briefcase. I could feel the tension in my shoulders start to loosen. Seattle felt like home again, but this time without the shadow of a feud gnawing at every thought. We spent the first few days back making wedding plans, slipping back into a rhythm that felt both exhilarating and calm. The guest list was short, the venue intimate. Vanessa wanted a ceremony overlooking Puget Sound, simple but elegant, with just the people who had stood by us through the worst of it. My mother had already started talking about flowers and music, her voice lighter now that the weight of divided loyalties was gone. It was on a Thursday morning over coffee and the Seattle Times that I saw Sophia Grant's face on the front page. She was holding a glass award, the headline reading, "Investigative Reporter Wins National Award for Real Estate Exposé." The article detailed her months-long investigation into Michael's dealings, the layers of deception, and how it all unraveled. Her voice, sharp but steady, came through in every quote they printed. She didn't mention me by name, but I could feel her acknowledgement in the way she spoke about people who refused to be intimidated into silence. The fallout for Michael was brutal. Within a week of the wedding debacle, the National Real Estate Association had announced his removal from their membership roster, citing ethical violations and conduct unbecoming of a member. It wasn't just a title stripped away. It was a public scarlet letter in an industry where reputation was currency. His largest partners pulled their investments almost overnight. Projects stalled mid-construction. For a man who built his empire on perception, the collapse was swift and merciless. But the damage didn't stop in the boardroom. Friends who had been in his inner circle for decades stopped returning his calls. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that his phone had gone from ringing constantly to silence. The golf course he used to hold court at every Saturday hadn't seen him in weeks. Even the charity boards he'd sat on quietly removed his name from their websites. The harshest blow came from his own household. Michael's wife, Lauren, had stood beside him through every photo op, every black tie gala. But humiliation once public seeps into the walls of a marriage. She moved out 2 months after the wedding, taking their son with her. The whispers about what she knew and when she knew it were everywhere, but what I saw was simpler a woman choosing not to sink with the ship. When my mother mentioned in passing that Lauren had stopped bringing the boy to visit Michael's mother, I knew the fracture wasn't just public, it was personal and deep. One rainy afternoon, Vanessa and I were in the kitchen finalizing the seating chart when my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. I let it ring out, but curiosity got the better of me, and I checked the voicemail. It was Michael. His voice was strained, almost hoarse. He didn't apologize outright, but there was something in the way he paused between sentences, like he was measuring each word to keep from breaking. He said he hoped Mom was well, that he understood I probably didn't want to hear from him, but he wanted me to know he was leaving Miami for a while. "There's nothing for me here anymore," he said at the end, and the line went dead. I stood there for a long moment, the phone still in my hand. Vanessa's eyes on me. I didn't feel vindicated the way I thought I would. What I felt was finality. Some things can be mended, but others, they just end. The wedding day came with a rare break in the clouds, the kind of soft sunlight that makes the water look like glass. My mother walked in with a smile I hadn't seen in years. Sophia was there too, standing near the back, a quiet nod in my direction as the music started. We said our vows with the sound of gulls overhead and the city skyline just visible through the haze. Later at the reception, Mom pulled me aside. She told me she was proud not just for winning back what was ours, but for standing my ground without becoming someone I wasn't. She admitted she had feared losing both sons in different ways, and though she knew things with Michael might never be the same, she was grateful at least one bridge had stayed intact. When the last guests had gone and the candles burned low, Vanessa and I stood on the balcony looking out over the Sound. The wind was cool but gentle, carrying the faint scent of salt and cedar. We talked about the island, about taking the yacht out again when the season turned, not to run from something this time, but to go toward it. Seattle's lights twinkled across the water, steady and sure. For the first time in a long time, I felt the quiet was something I'd earned. Not the silence of being shut out, but the peace that comes when the noise finally fades and you can hear your own voice again. And in that stillness, I knew we weren't just closing a chapter. We were starting something that didn't need anyone else's permission to exist. The water was calm under the morning sun, the kind of glassy stillness that made the horizon look endless. I leaned against the railing of the yacht, feeling the hum of the engines beneath my feet as we cut through the open sea. The island was a speck behind us now, the wind tugging lightly at my jacket. Vanessa was inside making coffee, her laughter drifting out through the open cabin door as she spoke with my mother. I let their voices fade into the background and kept my eyes on the water. It had been months since the dust settled, months since I stopped waking up with the taste of confrontation in my mouth. Looking back, the battles over papers, titles, and contracts seemed small compared to the real cost I had seen unfold. Michael had fought with everything he had, but in the end, what he lost wasn't just an island or a yacht. It was trust. It was the belief that his name opened doors instead of closing them. And it was the quiet presence of people who once stood beside him without question. I thought about the first crack in our bond years ago when I realized he was willing to bend the truth for a deal. Back then I thought the danger was the debt, the risk of losing property. Now I understood the debt that matters is the one you build when you trade integrity for advantage. That balance always comes due, and no lawyer or handshake can push off the payment forever. The sea had a rhythm today, a slow, steady lift that matched my breathing. I rested my hands on the railing and thought about how different this voyage felt from the last time we set out. Then it had been about making a statement, proving something to Michael, maybe even to myself. Now there was nothing left to prove. The island was safe, the yacht was ours, and the people who mattered were within reach. That was enough. Vanessa came up beside me, handing me a mug of coffee. She looked out at the horizon and asked if I felt like it was finally over. I told her it was, but not because the fight was won. It was over because I no longer needed the fight to define me. She smiled at that, leaning her head against my shoulder. The warmth of her hand around mine was more grounding than any legal victory could ever be. The sun climbed higher, casting a path of gold across the water. I could still picture Michael in the last moment I saw him, standing off to the side while the wedding guests whispered, his eyes darting for an exit that wasn't there. I wondered if he replayed the choices that led him there, if the weight of it all kept him awake in the way it had once kept me. The truth is, money can be earned back, properties can be rebuilt, but trust, respect, and the closeness of family don't come with a purchase price. Once those are gone, the loss is permanent. The yacht's bow cut through a gentle swell, sending a spray of salt water into the air. My mother stepped out onto the deck, her face softer than I'd seen in years. She told me she was glad I didn't let anger turn me into something unrecognizable, that patience and quiet action had done more than any outburst ever could. I knew she was right. It wasn't easy holding the line without swinging at every provocation. But sometimes silence isn't surrender. Sometimes it is the weight that tips the balance. We passed a small fishing boat, the crew waving as we went by. Vanessa waved back, laughing. It struck me that this was what peace felt like: no undercurrent of tension, no waiting for the next call or headline, just the steady churn of the sea beneath us. I took a sip of the coffee, now cooled, and let the salt in the air fill my lungs. As the day stretched on, the coastline began to fade again, leaving only the open water ahead. I knew we would anchor before nightfall, maybe watch the sun set from the deck, just the three of us. The idea of ending the day without any noise from the outside world felt like the rarest kind of luxury. If there's anything this journey taught me, it's that the real price isn't counted in dollars or deeds. The real price is the look in someone's eyes when they realize they can't go back. The silence that follows when trust has been spent past its limit. Betrayal has a currency all its own, and when the debt comes due, it takes more than you can ever plan to give. So if you're listening to this, think about what you're willing to risk for a short win and what you might lose forever in the process. Ask yourself what the cost would be if the people who matter most no longer believed in you. That's the price you can't buy back, no matter how deep your pockets go. What about you? Have you ever seen someone pay that kind of price or felt it yourself? I'd like to hear your story.